There are questions that do not arrive in the daylight, not because the daylight cannot hold them, but because the daylight is too full of answers, too busy with the noise of the already decided and the already explained. And so they wait, patient as water at depth, quiet as the space between heartbeats, for moments like this one, when the world has finally gone still, and the body has begun its long, unhurried process of releasing everything it carried through the hours of ordinary life. And the question that has been waiting longest, the question that may be older than language itself, older than the first fire lit against the first darkness, older perhaps than the species that learned to ask it, is this: where did we come from? And what are we, really, in the deepest and most honest sense of that word? Not the biological account, not the official story, not the version that has been handed down through textbooks and consensus, but the true and undecided and still open answer to the question of what kind of thing a human being actually is. There is something in the asking of this question that cannot be fully replicated in daylight hours, something that requires the specific quality of attention that only comes available when the obligations of the day have retreated far enough to allow the mind to move at its own pace in its own direction, without the requirement that it arrive somewhere useful within a specified time. The asking requires a kind of darkness, not the darkness of ignorance, but the darkness of the night, the particular condition of stillness and permission that allows the mind to go deep rather than fast, to stay with something rather than move through it, to hold a question not as an obstacle between the present and the desired answer, but as a space worth inhabiting for its own sake. You are listening to Midnight Sleep Chronicles, and tonight our archives open around one of the most ancient and unresolved investigations in the history of human thought, an inquiry that science has not closed, that mythology has not exhausted, and that philosophy has circled for thousands of years without ever quite arriving at the center. As though the center itself keeps moving, as though the question is the kind of question whose value lies not in the answer, but in the quality of attention it demands from the person who holds it. Tonight we ask, what if we do not yet know what we are? And what if that not knowing is not a failure, but the most honest and luminous place we have ever stood? If there is, somewhere in these words, a question you have carried quietly for a long time, a question about your own origins, your own strangeness, the particular way you have sometimes felt that the story you were given about what you are does not quite account for everything you actually are, then I invite you to carry it with you into this night, not to resolve it, only to let it breathe in, only to let it, the dark. And if something in this night stays with you, a question, a memory, a place on this earth where you have once felt most fully yourself, I hope you will leave it in the comments when the morning comes. The people who find their way to this space do so for reasons that matter. And what they carry is part of what makes it worth returning to. We begin. There is a cave in the south of France, in a region of limestone cliffs that the Ardèche River has been carving for 30,000 years, where the walls hold something that should not, by any logic of gradual development and slow accumulation, exist. It was discovered in 1994 by 3 explorers who lowered themselves through a narrow opening in the earth and found themselves standing in a gallery that no human being had entered in approximately 36,000 years. And what they found there, in the torchlight, on walls that had been waiting in complete darkness for longer than most of the world's great civilizations have existed, was not the crude scratchings that the story of human development would lead you to expect. not the tentative marks of a species still learning to represent what it sees, still feeling its way toward the idea of image and line and composition, but something closer to the opposite of all of that. The horses on these walls move with a fluency that painters spent centuries trying to recover. The rhinoceroses in procession carry in their outlines the suggestion of weight and momentum that requires not just observation, but something harder to define. A quality of interior understanding, of having looked at a living thing for so long and from so many directions that the image holds not just the animal's appearance, but its presence. The lions, caught in some moment of communal stillness, arrange themselves in a frieze that understands negative space, that plays the empty wall against the filled outline with the confidence of someone who has mastered a vocabulary rather than encountering it for the first time. When Pablo Picasso came out of the Lascaux caves, which are ancient but not as ancient as Chauvet, not by a distance of nearly 20,000 years, he said something that has not stopped being true since the day he said it. He said, "We have learned nothing. The scientists who have spent their careers studying the oldest images of our species have arrived, with evident discomfort, at a conclusion that sits uneasily alongside the story they were trained to tell. There is no developmental trail. There is no gallery of early hesitant marks leading gradually toward the accomplished images of the deep caves. The sophisticated work appears in the geological record as though it arrived, as though the capacity for it did not accumulate over generations of practice, but came with the species that made it, fully formed, waiting only for the moment when someone decided to press pigment to limestone and begin. This is one piece of what has been building in the corners of paleoanthropology and genetics and archaeology into something that the official account of human origins is finding increasingly difficult to absorb without modification. The second piece lives in the genome itself. When geneticists first began the large-scale work of comparing the genetic diversity of all living human populations, the result that came back from the data was surprising enough that it reshaped a field. The genetic distance between any two human beings chosen at random from opposite ends of the Earth, from the highlands of Papua New Guinea and the plains of Scandinavia, from the Amazon basin and the Mongolian steppe, is, in the language of population genetics, remarkably small. Smaller, in fact, than the genetic distance between two chimpanzees from neighboring populations in the same forest. What this means is that all of living humanity, every person now, breathing on this planet across every culture and every continent, descends from a population that was, by the standards of what we know about how genetic diversity accumulates over time, extraordinarily narrow. A group so limited in its numbers that the entire subsequent diversity of our species grew from what amounts, in evolutionary terms, to a handful of founders. The question that this finding raises, and that population genetics has been circling without resolution for several decades, is this: where did all the others go? Because the predecessors were there. Homo erectus had been walking the earth for nearly 2 million years. The Neanderthals had occupied Europe and Western Asia for 300,000 years before our ancestors arrived, building shelters, burying their dead, caring for their injured, creating the rudiments of what looks very much like culture. The Denisovans, known to us now through fragments of bone and a single tooth, and the extraordinary information preserved in ancient DNA, were a people substantial enough to have left their genetic signature in the populations of Asia and the Pacific, where between 3 and 5% of the genome of living people carries what they contributed. All of them are gone. All of the parallel branches of the human family, the contemporaries and the cousins and the others who shared this planet with our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years, vanished within a span of time that, on the scale of evolution, is almost nothing. 50 to 70,000 years ago, the great simplification happened, and we were left as the only kind of thing that we are. No one knows why, and that not knowing is not a small thing. There are theories, carefully argued and professionally held, but none of them has closed the question. The competitive advantage of anatomically modern humans is invoked with confidence, but the evidence for it is thin. Because for tens of thousands of years, the tools made by our ancestors were, by the measures available to archaeology, indistinguishable from the tools made by the Neanderthals who preceded them. In the caves of Israel, in the archaeological strata of a single location, where both populations left their traces over tens of thousands of years. The anthropologists who excavate the site note with a kind of careful understatement that if you were to judge the sophistication of the inhabitants by the objects they left behind, you would be unable to determine which layer belonged to which species. And then, roughly 40 to 60,000 years ago, something changed. Not gradually, not in the way that slow evolutionary pressure accumulates through generations of incremental advantage, but with the quality of a light being switched on. The appearance in the archaeological record of decorated objects, of personal adornment, of image-making, of what looks unmistakably like symbolic thought operating in the world through material, through pigment and shell and ochre and carved bone. The cognitive leap that should, in a strictly evolutionary account, have taken hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate, appears to have happened within a span of time that makes the word sudden feel almost appropriate. Let that sit for a moment. Let the full weight of what is being described find its level. The standard account of human cognitive development, the one that appears in textbooks and documentaries and the confident summaries of popular science, describes a gradual process, the brain enlarging slowly over millions of years of evolutionary pressure, the capacity for language emerging incrementally through the accumulation of small genetic advantages, the ability for abstract thought developing by degrees as successive generations inherited slightly more sophisticated neural architectures than their parents. In this account, the human mind that painted the caves of Chauvet is the product of an unbroken chain of gradual improvements stretching back through millions of years of life on the African savanna. And the sophistication of those paintings is simply the visible expression of the endpoint of that long process. But the fossil and genetic record does not fully support this account, and the places where it fails to support it are not small details at the margins, but structural features at the center. The brain of Homo sapiens reached approximately its current size, not gradually, but in a relatively compressed period. And the anatomical changes that produced it left behind an organ whose full range of capabilities appears, by the evidence of what human beings actually do with it, to have been present well before there is any archaeological evidence that those capabilities were being used. The capacity for symbolic thought, for mathematical reasoning, for the composition of music, for the creation of literature, for the investigation of the structure of the cosmos. All of these appear to require essentially the same neural architecture, and that architecture was in place, fully formed, for a very long time before there is any evidence of its being employed. This is sometimes described as a latency period, an interval between the development of the capacity and the expression of it. But the interval is long enough, and the sudden emergence of the expression is dramatic enough, that the phrase latency period functions more as a label for the mystery than as an explanation of it. You do not sit on a capacity to compose symphonies for 100,000 years and then suddenly begin. Something happened. What it was remains genuinely uncertain. The genetic record adds another layer to this, when researchers began the systematic work of comparing the genome of modern humans with the genomes of our closest relatives and our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, reconstructed painstakingly from fragments of bone. They found something that has become one of the more quietly disquieting findings in the field. The differences are smaller than anyone expected, and the specific genetic changes that appear to be associated with distinctively human cognitive capacities are, in many cases, not changes to the protein-coding genes themselves, but changes to the regulatory regions, the switches, in the language of molecular biology, that determine when and where and how much a given gene is expressed. What this means, in plain language, is that the difference between what we are and what our closest relatives are may lie less in the possession of different genes than in the activation pattern of genes that were already present. A difference in which switches are thrown, in which capacities are turned on and which remain dormant, rather than a difference in the underlying toolkit itself. The same toolkit, differently switched. And notice its resonance with the ancient texts, with the popolwuj fog placed over perfect vision, with the Sumerian tablets' deliberate limitations pressed into a being already capable of more, with Plato's veil of forgetting laid over knowledge that the soul already carries. There is one more anomaly worth holding before we move deeper into the night, because it sits at the intersection of the biological and the almost embarrassingly specific. Every primate species on Earth, whose anatomy includes it, possesses what is called a baculum, a bone in the penis, present in mammals across dozens of orders, serving a structural function in reproduction that has been conserved by evolution across hundreds of millions of years of divergence because of its evident utility. The great apes have it. Our closest living relatives retain it. And anatomically modern humans, uniquely among all the primates to which we are most closely related, do not. The loss of this structure is not explained by any adaptive pressure that has been identified with confidence. It is not the kind of modification that gradual selection produces easily, because it involves the restructuring of a system, the development of a different mechanism dependent on neural and vascular processes to perform the function that the absent structure previously provided. And evolution is conservative in exactly the proportion that the modification required here is radical. Consider, alongside this, the matter of the hair on the human head, a detail so familiar that its strangeness has been entirely domesticated by familiarity. On every other surface of the body, human hair grows to a modest length and stops, governed by a growth cycle calibrated to the proportions of the surface it covers, thinning and replacing itself in a rhythm that keeps it at a length appropriate to its apparent biological functions of insulation and protection. But the hair on the head grows continuously, at a rate that will, if left entirely unchecked, produce by the 7th or 8th year of a child's life a length of hair that falls past the child's feet and begins to actively impede movement, dragging on the ground, catching on obstacles, requiring constant management simply to allow the person to function. No other primate has this characteristic. No other primate produces hair on any part of its body that grows continuously without a built-in mechanism to stop. The adaptive explanation for this feature is elusive. A characteristic that requires constant attention simply to prevent it from becoming a physical liability is not, on the face of it, what an evolutionary process optimizing for survival would predictably produce. And the explanations that have been offered for it have the quality of accommodations rather than solutions, the quality of fitting a given answer into a frame that was designed for a different question. These are, taken individually, small things. They are the kind of anomalies that any complex system will produce, the loose threads in any large fabric, the details that do not quite fit the pattern without being sufficient to disprove it. but they share a quality that is worth noticing before we let them go. They all point toward the same region, the region where the standard account is thinnest, where the explanation requires the most supplementary argumentation, where the confidence of the textbook version is most dependent on not looking too closely at the specific evidence it is built on. That region is the question of what happened approximately 50 to 70,000 years ago to produce the specific configuration of traits, capacities, and peculiarities that constitutes the being asking the question right now. The being lying here in the dark at the end of a day, holding a question about its own origins with the specific quality of attention that only this kind of being, in the entire observable universe, is capable of bringing to a question about itself. The map runs out here. The terrain is what remains. Take a breath. Let the body settle a little further into whatever is holding it. The scientific record has brought us to the edge of what it can account for, to a threshold where the bones and the data and the careful measurements arrive and then stand, unable to go further, gesturing at something on the other side. What is on the other side is older than the science. It is older than the writing that preserved it. It has been carried in clay and in memory, and in the mouths of people telling stories around fires that went dark thousands of years before anyone thought to ask for evidence. And what it says across every language and every civilization that has thought carefully enough about the question to leave a record is that the story of what we are did not begin with chance. There is a clay tablet, one of several 100,000 recovered, from the ruins of libraries that are older than the pyramids, that was pressed into form in the valley between two rivers in what is now the southern part of Iraq, by hands that moved through a world so different from ours that the imagination strains to cross the distance. And yet the story pressed into that clay, in the wedge-shaped marks of a script that took scholars generations to decode, is a story that a child of the 21st century, lying in the dark after a day of molecular biology and genome sequencing, would find startling in its apparent familiarity. The story concerns a decision made by beings, so the tablets call by the name which translates, roughly, as those of royal blood, or those of heaven and earth. Beings who had arrived, the tablets say, from somewhere beyond, who had established themselves in the Fertile Crescent, who had set to work on a project whose scale and ambition the tablets describe with a matter-of-factness that is itself a kind of strangeness, because matter-of-factness is the tone you use for things you understand, for things that have been domesticated by familiarity. And what the tablets describe is not domesticated and has not been made familiar by any subsequent discovery that has resolved the question of what these texts are actually recording. The decision was this: to make a worker, a being that could labor in their place, could learn what was needed and no more, could be shaped to the purpose without being shaped to the full scope of what the makers themselves were. The tablets describe the deliberation with surprising specificity. There are those among the ruling group who argue against the project on grounds that sound, in translation, almost ethical. A concern about the nature of what is being proposed, about the morality of designing a being for a purpose, of taking a living creature and reshaping it toward an intention that is not its own. There is a figure in the story who argues for the project on the grounds that what is proposed is not the creation of something new, but the improvement of something already present, a modification of an existing creature that will bring it closer to the capacity required, rather than the invention of something from nothing. This distinction matters to the deliberating group in a way that the tablets record with care, as though it represents a genuine ethical boundary rather than a mere procedural technicality. The figure who leads the project bears a name that the tablets associate with wisdom, with water, with the mysteries of life. A name that later traditions will encode in the image of the serpent, in the symbol of two intertwined snakes that healers still use today. Though the original association of that image with wisdom and with the knowledge of living systems has been largely lost to the translation that turns a complex figure into a simple villain. The project, according to the tablets, did not succeed immediately. The first attempts produced beings that were either not viable or not capable of the tasks required. Beings that could not sustain themselves, could not reproduce, could not carry the full range of functions that the work demanded. The tablets record a series of attempts, a sequence of modifications, a gradual refinement of what had been made. And this too has a texture that is difficult to dismiss as pure mythology, because it is not the texture of a creation story. Creation stories, across cultures, tend toward the decisive, the word spoken and the world existing, the clay shaped and the creature living, the act of will and the immediate result. What the Sumerian tablets describe is not a creation story. It is a process. It has the texture of research. The final product, the being that could work, that could learn and follow instruction and reproduce and sustain itself across generations, was produced, the tablets say, by a combination that involved the biological material of the makers themselves, pressed into the biological material of a creature already living in the region, and carried by a surrogate to term. The number the tablets give for the initial group of these beings is small enough that, if you were to describe it to a geneticist studying the narrow genetic bottleneck of the human population, the correspondence would produce a moment of pause. The tablets make no claim to be the only record of this. What is more interesting than any single claim about their literal truth is the recognition that this story was not told only here, on the other side of an ocean that no one in Mesopotamia had crossed, in a region of the Maya highlands where a civilization had been developing for thousands of years in complete independence from the river valleys of Sumer. There is a document called the Book of the Community, the popolwuj, which is among the most remarkable texts to have survived the catastrophe of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. And the Book of the Community contains a creation story that, when placed alongside the Sumerian tablets, produces a resonance that the mind keeps returning to the way the tongue returns to a strange tooth. The gods in this story are also deliberating. They also make multiple attempts. They also produce, through their early efforts, beings that are not quite what they intended. Creatures that can move and eat, but cannot speak, cannot think, cannot offer the recognition and the reciprocity that the creators seem to require from whatever they are trying to bring into existence. They try mud, and the mud dissolves. They try wood, and the wooden people survive but are empty. They go through the motions of life without being, in some quality the text finds essential, actually alive to it. Finally, they work with the fundamental substance of the living world in the landscape they inhabit. With corn, with the material that the Maya civilization understands as the ground of all nourishment. And from this they make the beings who can speak and understand and carry in themselves the quality of genuine interiority that the earlier attempts produced only the appearance of. But then, and this is the turn that the Sumerian tablets also make, in their own way, from their own direction, the gods are troubled by what they have made. Because what they have made is too good. The first people, in the account of the popolwuj, have perfect vision and perfect understanding, not limited to the immediate and the local, but extending to the full scope of what exists, the full range of the world's meaning, the capacity for comprehension that the makers themselves possess. and the makers look at what they have created and decide that this cannot stand. Not because the people are wicked, but because the people are, in this state of complete understanding, too similar to those made them. And the makers want to be distinct, want to be recognized as the source, want to be in a relationship with their creation that has a structure. And so they act to reduce what the people can perceive, to draw a veil across the full scope of their vision, to leave them with enough to function and to thrive, but less than they were made to carry. The fog was placed over their eyes, and what they had seen clearly became difficult to see, and what had been known directly became a matter of searching and interpretation, and the patient accumulation of partial understanding. The Egyptian tradition held its version of this story in the image of the craftsman god Khnum, who shaped human beings on a potter's wheel from the clay of the Nile, but who shaped them with the deliberateness of an artisan, attending to the requirements of a particular design. Not creating indiscriminately, but forming with intention, instilling in each being the specific configuration of soul substance that would carry it through the conditions of its life. And running alongside that image, in the vast and internally diverse theology of ancient Egypt, there is another figure, the ibis-headed keeper of sacred knowledge, who the Greeks would later call Thoth, the measurer of time and the weigher of hearts and the source of the written word itself, who stands in the tradition as the one who taught, who gave to human beings the instruments of understanding that allow them to navigate between the world they can see and the world that ordinarily lies beyond their perception. The gift of knowledge as a gift given by a figure of extraordinary power to beings who would not have arrived at it on their own. This thread runs not only through the Egyptian and Sumerian and Maya traditions, but through the Norse account of Odin hanging on the world tree for 9 days without food or water to bring the runes out of the deep, and through the Greek account of Prometheus stealing fire from the domain of the gods and carrying it down to the creatures below, and through the Vedic account of the divine teacher Brihaspati, who instructed the gods themselves in the knowledge of the cosmos, whose learning flowed outward and downward through the structure of existence to the beings embedded in matter at its furthest extension. Across these traditions, separated by oceans and by centuries, there runs a common understanding of the human being as something that received its essential capacities from outside itself, not as an organism that developed those capacities through the blind operation of natural selection alone, but as a being to whom something was given, deliberately and from a source that stands in relation to ordinary human life, the way that the maker of a thing stands in relation to the thing that has been made. There is a philosopher of the Mediterranean world, writing in Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era, who describes this same structure through a different set of images, who proposes that what appears to human beings as the process of learning is actually the process of remembering, that the knowledge which arrives in us through inquiry was already present before the inquiry began, that birth into a body is the event that draws the veil, and that the entire activity of a human life, at its deepest level, is the gradual and never quite complete recovery of what was always already known. He calls this the undoing of forgetting. He means it in part as a literal description of what he believes the soul actually carries across the boundary of incarnation. But even if you hold it as a metaphor rather than a cosmology, the territory it describes is recognizable. The sense that full understanding is somehow native to us rather than acquired, that we are not so much learning things as being reminded of them, that the moment of genuine comprehension feels less like arrival at something new and more like recognition of something familiar. The Norse tradition spoke of beings shaped from trees, from ash and elm, the first man and woman given breath and consciousness, and the warmth of blood, by three great powers passing on the shore of the New World, each power contributing something that the others could not provide alone. The whole of what a human being is distributed across three sources, none of which is sufficient by itself. The ash tree from which the first man was shaped is itself a figure of enormous significance in Norse cosmology. It is Yggdrasil, the world tree, the axis around which all the 9 worlds are organized, whose roots reach into the realm of the dead and whose branches touch the sky. And the man made from ash carries in the material of his making, the whole structure of the cosmos, the whole vertical range of what exists from its deepest roots to its highest branches, encoded in the substance of a single body. The image rewards staying with, because what it implies about the nature of the human being is not small. If the first human was shaped from the same material as the axis of all worlds, if what you are made of is not a minor and peripheral material, but the structural substance of the cosmos itself, then the question of what you are capable of, the question of what depth of knowing and what breadth of connection are actually available to you, is a different question than the one that the standard biological account would prompt you to ask. It is a question that points in the direction of the very traditions that have reported, with consistency across generations, that the depth available to human consciousness when the conditions are right is not shallow, not easily exhausted, not well described by the surface that ordinary experience presents. The Celtic peoples of the western edges of Europe, living in a landscape of extraordinary atmospheric complexity, in places where the light changes by the hour and the boundary between land and water is never quite stable, developed an understanding of the human being as a creature that stands at the intersection of 2 worlds. The visible world of ordinary daily life and the invisible world that underlies it, that pervades it, that is always present beneath and behind and within it, accessible under certain conditions to certain kinds of attention. The thinness of the places they identified as thin, the edges of water, the tops of hills, the particular hours at dawn and dusk when neither darkness nor light fully prevails, was understood not as a spatial property of the locations themselves, but as a perceptual property of beings capable of noticing the depth that is always present beneath the surface of things. The human being, in this understanding, is constitutionally equipped for a kind of perception that most conditions of ordinary life suppress, equipped to sense the invisible world, built to inhabit both registers simultaneously, temporarily reduced to the single channel of ordinary sensory experience by the conditions of embodied life, but not permanently or irrevocably limited to it. What is striking, when you place this Celtic understanding alongside the Sumerian deliberation about limiting what they had made, and alongside the Maya fog drawn over the eyes of the first perfect people, is not the differences between these traditions, which are considerable, shaped by entirely different landscapes and cosmologies and historical situations, but the structural similarity at the center, the shared sense that what ordinary human experience delivers is not the full scope of what human consciousness was made to receive, that something in the conditions of embodied life acts as a filter on a capacity that is wider and deeper than the filter allows through, and that certain conditions, the thin places, the deep still of a night like this one, the patient practice of traditions that have been refining their instruments for centuries, allow the filter to become briefly less absolute, allow something of the wider signal to come through. None of these accounts is the same story. They come from different landscapes and different centuries and different civilizational concerns, shaped by different relationships to the natural world, and different conceptions of what the divine is and what the human is, and what the relationship between them might require. but they share something that is worth staying with in the dark. Every one of them describes a human being as something that was made with intention. Every one of them places at the origin of what we are not chance or accident or the blind operation of impersonal forces, but something more deliberate, a decision, an act of will, a shaping force that attended to the specific qualities of what was being produced. And every one of them, in its own way, preserves idea that what was placed in us at the making, whatever it is that constitutes the deepest and most irreducible part of being human, is something more and stranger than the biological story alone would lead us to expect. There is also, running through several of these traditions, a thread that makes the body grow quiet in a particular way when you allow yourself to fully hear it. The suggestion that what we are was, at some point in the process of our making, deliberately limited. That the full scope of what we were made to hold was reduced, not lost, not destroyed, but placed beneath a surface that ordinary experience cannot easily penetrate. The way deep water lies beneath shallower water, present but not immediately visible, accessible only under particular conditions of stillness and attention. The veil over the eyes of the first Maya people, the fog that separates the Platonic soul from the knowledge it carried before birth, the inactive portions of the genome, the sections that molecular biology calls by the dismissive name of junk, the sequences that appear to serve no current function and whose purpose, if they have one, remains largely unknown, but which constitute a substantial majority of the total genetic material present in every human cell, waiting in silence for a condition that has not yet arrived, or perhaps for the recollection of a condition that once existed and has since been covered over. These are not the same thing. They are images from different systems pointing, from different angles, at something they cannot see directly. But the consistency of the direction in which they point, the convergence of the gestures, even when the gestures come from hands that never knew each other existed, is the kind of thing that deserves to be held quietly in the dark, without being forced into a conclusion it has not yet reached. This is the moment to let the stories release their grip on the analytical mind, not because they have finished saying what they have to say. They have not, and they will not, because the kind of thing they point at cannot be fully said, but because the part of you that needs to evaluate and compare and decide has been listening long enough. And what comes next belongs to the part of you that simply rests. Let the breath do its work. Let the clay and the limestone and the long patience of the traditions settle into the body the way that warmth settles. Not as information to be retained, but as something absorbed below the level where information lives, into the place that has always known what the surface keeps having to be reminded of. Let the images settle now, the way pigment settles through water, not disappearing, but finding their level. Because what has been moving through this night is not an argument. It is not a case being made for one account of human origins over another, not a dismantling of one tradition to clear space for installation of a different one. It is something more like an invitation to a particular quality of standing, the quality of standing at the edge of a genuine question, a question that has not been answered, a question that the best available minds, working in the best available traditions, have been pressing against for as long as human beings have been the kind of thing that presses against questions, and that has not yet given way. What this particular question offers, when you are willing to stand at its edge without requiring it to resolve itself into a comfortable answer, is not the relief of knowing, but something that may be more valuable than that. The spaciousness that opens when certainty withdraws and the full scope of what might be becomes available again. consider what it would mean, not as a belief to be held and defended, but as a hypothesis to be followed in the spirit in which a scientist follows a hypothesis, with the willingness to go where the evidence leads without requiring the evidence to confirm what was already decided. Consider what it would mean if the oldest texts were recording something closer to event than to allegory. If the creation accounts that appear with such structural consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other are not independent inventions of the same metaphors, but independent refractions of the same memory, distorted by time and by the specific vocabularies of specific civilizations, shaped by the concerns and the cosmologies of the people who preserved them, but pointing beneath all of that at something that actually happened. It would mean, among other things, that the question of what we are is not closed. Not by science, which has described with extraordinary precision the biological mechanisms of what we do and how we function, but which has not resolved the question of where the capacity for symbolic thought came from, or why the genetic diversity of our species is so narrow, or what caused the cognitive explosion that produced the caves of Chauvet and Lascaux without leaving behind a developmental trail. Not by any of the ancient traditions which have preserved, with remarkable consistency across the distances that separate them, the outline of an account that describes something more deliberate and more complex than chance, but which encode their knowledge in images and narratives that require interpretation rather than delivering it directly. And not by philosophy, which has circled the question of human nature for more than 2,000 years and produced, in the circling, extraordinary illuminations of the territory, without ever arriving at the kind of final account that makes further inquiry unnecessary. The question is open, and that openness is not a failure of the inquiry, but the most honest description of where we actually stand. And there is something about standing honestly in an open question that the body, when it has been allowed to be still for long enough, recognizes as a quality of rest. Not the rest of resolution, not the rest that comes when a problem has been solved and filed away, but the deeper rest that becomes available when the grip of the need to know relaxes, when the urgency that the daytime mind applies to uncertainty loosens its hold. And what remains is simply the question itself, held lightly, inhabited without being pressed, allowed to be as large as it actually is. You carry in the cells of your body a genome of which the known function accounts for only a fraction of the total. The rest, the silent majority of the genetic material that makes you what you are, waits in a darkness that molecular biology has mapped without fully illuminating, present and intact and chemically functional in the sense of being structurally there, but not currently expressed, not currently speaking in the language that the cell listens for, not currently doing whatever it is capable of doing. This is not speculation. It is the established finding of decades of careful measurement, confirmed by every method available to genomic science. The majority of what you carry at the most fundamental biological level of your being is, in the vocabulary of the science that discovered it, silent. What if silence is not the same as absence? What if the parts of us that do not currently speak are not therefore nothing, not junk, not evolutionary debris, not the accumulated accidental material of a genome that has no editor, but something more like the deep water the ancient texts kept returning to, the water below the shallower water, the knowing beneath the knowing that is accessible, the full scope of what was placed in us lying below the surface, that ordinary conditions allow us to reach. The Vedic tradition spent thousands of years developing a systematic technology of attention, a set of practices for moving the ordinary, restless, surface-skimming quality of daily consciousness down into the stillness below it, into the deep water, into the part of the mind that is not agitated by the demands of the waking day, and that carries, in its stillness, a quality of knowing that the surface cannot access. The tradition was not making metaphors. It was recording, with the precision of a lineage that had been refining its instruments over centuries, what actually happens to consciousness when it stops moving fast enough to fall below the speed at which it ordinarily operates. What it found there, what the tradition reported, with consistency across generations and across the considerable disagreements that living traditions always contain, was not nothing. It was not the void that the Western mind tends to imagine when it tries to picture the cessation of ordinary thought. It was a quality of awareness that those who encountered it described, always with the acknowledgement that the description was inadequate to the thing, as more rather than less, as fuller rather than emptier, as a kind of knowing that makes ordinary knowing look like a very bright but very narrow beam of light compared to the quality of illumination that is available when the beam is extinguished and the eyes have had time to adjust. The Celtic tradition spoke of thin places, locations in the physical landscape, where the membrane between the ordinary surface of experience and the depth beneath it was notably more permeable than elsewhere, where the quality of time was different, where the sense of the present resting on something very old and very continuous was not a philosophical position, but an immediate sensory experience, as present as the air, and as unmistakable as the particular quality of light that those places carried. The Sufi tradition described a dimension of experience they called the isthmus, a threshold between the purely material and the purely spiritual, accessible in states of heightened attention or at the edges of ordinary consciousness, where the boundaries that the waking mind draws between past and present and future become less absolute, where something of the full structure of time is briefly perceptible, rather than only the moving point within it that embodied consciousness is ordinarily constrained to inhabit. These are not the same description. They are different instruments measuring, from different positions, the same territory, the territory that lies below the ordinary surface of human experience, beneath the layer of noise and urgency and the continuous demand of the immediate, in the place where the still water is. And there is a question that this night has been building toward, slowly, in the way that deep water builds toward the surface, in places where something below is rising. A question that the science and the mythology and the philosophy have been approaching from their different angles, without any of them quite reaching the center of it. The question is this: what if the quality of awareness that the ancient traditions described as lying beneath the surface of ordinary experience is not a spiritual achievement, not the product of discipline and practice alone, but the natural state of what we actually are, available to us not because we have earned it through effort, but because it was placed in us at the making, because it is part of the original design, because the veil that the Mayan texts describe and the limitation that the Sumerian tablets record is exactly what it appears to be. Something imposed on a capacity that was already present, something that thins under certain conditions, something that the deep rest of a night like this one allows to become, if only very slightly and very briefly, more permeable. What if the feeling that you sometimes have, the feeling that you are more than the version of yourself that moves through ordinary days, that something in you knows more and sees further and holds a wider scope than the identity that gets up in the morning and answers to your name? What if that feeling is not vanity, not grandiosity, not the self-flattering fantasy of a species that cannot accept its own ordinariness? What if it is accurate perception, not the perception of something you have achieved or developed or earned, but the perception of something you were given, something that was pressed into you at the making, and that has been waiting in the silence of the genome and the stillness of the deep mind, and the patience of the oldest question in the human archive, for the condition that would allow it to be recognized. The caves of Chauvet are 36,000 years old, and the hands that painted them knew something about what it means to be a creature with consciousness and a relationship to the visible world that is not merely functional, but somehow loving, somehow devoted to the act of seeing things fully and rendering them with care. Those hands are your hands. At a distance of 36,000 years, the awareness that moved through them as they pressed ochre to stone is the awareness that is resting behind your eyes right now, receiving the dark. There is a continuity here that does not require the resolution of the question of our origins to be real. Whatever the true account of what we are, whatever combination of the evolutionary and the deliberate, the natural and the designed, the chance and the intended, the continuity of the awareness is not in question. The awareness that asks the question has been asking it in one form or another, since the first being for whom the question was available. It is old beyond the reach of dating methods. It is present in the Sumerian scribe pressing the reed into clay, and in the Maya elder speaking the popolwuj to a child in firelight, and in the Greek philosopher walking in his garden with a question that would not resolve itself. And it is present here, in this room, in this darkness, in the particular quality of attention that comes available at the edges of sleep, when the demand to already know things has finally released its grip. Let the attention rest now on the specific weight of the body, the particular points of contact between skin and surface, the temperature of the air, the rhythm of the breath that continues without requiring your participation, that has been continuing since the first breath and will continue until the last, that is happening right now in the same way that the breath of the oldest human ancestor happened, in the same fundamental relationship between a body and the atmosphere of a living planet that has been sustaining that relationship for longer than the question of origins has existed. There is something that happens to a question when you carry it for long enough without demanding that it resolve. Something that the daytime mind, with its orientation toward conclusions and its intolerance for ambiguity, tends to prevent by the sheer force of its impatience. The question changes texture. It stops feeling like a problem that is blocking your progress and begins feeling like a companion, like a quality of attention that walks alongside you, like a depth in the present moment that is available precisely because the need to resolve it has loosened its grip. The philosophers of several traditions have noticed this transformation and tried to describe it. In the Zen tradition of Japan, the deliberate use of an unanswerable question, not to produce an answer, but to produce in the person holding it a particular quality of sustained, open, non-grasping attention, is one of the central instruments of the practice. The question is given not to be solved, but to be inhabited, to be carried until the carrying itself produces the change in consciousness that the question was designed to invite. What the question opens, through the sustained pressure of its unresolvability, is not the relief of an answer, but something more spacious than relief. A state of attention that has stopped performing the effort of reaching toward what it does not yet have and has begun. Instead, to notice what is already present. The question of what we are has been held here, in the dark, in the gradual slowing of the body and the loosening of the day's demands. And what it has opened is not an answer, but a quality. The specific quality of a consciousness that has allowed itself to be genuinely uncertain about its own deepest nature, and found, in that allowing, not the anxiety of not knowing, but the particular spaciousness that comes when the urgent need to have already arrived at the answer releases its grip, and the full extent of the territory becomes visible. The territory is vast, It extends from the ochre on the cave walls to the clay of the tablets, to the living silence of the genome, to the depth of the night that is gathered around you now. And it has been occupied by every human being who has ever lived without being exhausted by any of them. Because the question it contains is the kind that grows larger the more carefully it is examined, not smaller. The kind that reveals new dimensions precisely in proportion to the attentiveness brought to it. This is not a failure of the question. It is the quality that makes it inexhaustible. It is the quality that has kept human beings returning to it across every culture and every century, not because they expected to finally close it this time, but because the returning itself is worth something. Because the act of standing honestly in the open field of a question that has not been answered is one of the things that the human capacity for attention was made for, whatever the making consisted of, and whoever or whatever did the making. And perhaps that is, in the end, the most honest thing that can be said about the question of our origins. That whatever we are the kind of thing that can ask it, that can hold it, that can find in the holding not distress, but something that functions, in the long run, very much like meaning. Not the meaning of an answer arrived at and filed away, but the living meaning of a question that keeps the attention awake and the capacity for wonder intact and the sense of depth in the ordinary surface of things accessible to anyone willing to be still for long enough. You are the current expression of something very old. Not in the way that the phrase usually means, not merely as the biological descendant of prior biological beings, not simply as the latest link in a chain of genetic material passing forward through time, but in a deeper sense that this night has been building toward. You are the current expression of a question that the universe has been asking about itself for as long as there have been beings capable of asking it. And the question is asking itself through you right now, in the particular and unrepeatable form that you are. In the specific configuration of whatever it is that looks out through your eyes and holds this darkness and finds in it not emptiness, but depth. The genome carries what it carries, silent and present and waiting. The caves carry what they carry, pigment on limestone, image without explanation, beauty that arrived without a developmental trail, evidence of a capacity whose origins remain open. The tablets carry what they carry, story pressed in clay by hands that may have been recording something that happened, or imagining something that might have happened, or doing something more complex than either of those. Translating into the vocabulary of their civilization an account of the world's nature that had been passed to them by those who came before. The way all knowledge is passed, through the long chain of people sitting with a question in the dark and adding their own slight understanding to the version they received. And you carry what you carry, not as information that can be retrieved and examined, not as a file in an archive that can be opened on demand, but as the actual shape of what you are, the capacity for the specific quality of awareness that can lie in the dark and hold a question as large as the question of what it is, and find in the holding not anxiety, but something closer to wonder. Not the restlessness of not knowing, but the particular spaciousness of an open question inhabited with full attention. Every person whose voice has mattered to you has shaped the specific sensitivity with which you hear voices now. Every place you have loved has left its particular quality of light in the way you notice light in rooms that remind you of it. Every grief you have moved through is present in the specific way you now hold the uncertainty that grief teaches. Not as a memory of the grieving, but as an actual modification of the capacity for patience that you carry into every situation where patience is required. None of this is stored as memory. All of it is what you actually are. The history is not in an archive you can open. It is the material that the present version of you is made of. The way the iron in your blood is not stored somewhere in the body as a record of the star that forged it, but is simply the blood, doing its work, carrying its oxygen, with no memory of the billions of years that separate that first nuclear furnace from this particular breath. The iron in your blood was forged in the interior of a star that burned for millions of years and then ended in an explosion so complete that for a few weeks it outshone the entire galaxy that contained it. The iron it scattered into space traveled through the cold dark for longer than there have been living things on Earth, and eventually became part of the cloud that condensed into this solar system, and eventually became part of the ocean, and eventually became part of the chemistry of living things, and eventually became part of you, doing the specific and irreplaceable work that iron does in blood, carrying oxygen to every cell of the body that is lying here right now, doing this work without any memory of the star that made it possible. Simply present, simply functional, simply the current form of something very old that is doing what very old things do, which is continue. This is the deepest available sense in which you have been here before. Not in this room, not on this particular night, not with this particular arrangement of everything that constitutes the current version of a life. But here, in the ongoing fact of being a consciousness present in a moment, which is the same territory that has always been the territory, the same quality of awareness moving through time that has characterized every consciousness that has ever been aware of itself, the same presence at the edge of the unknown, and that has always been the position of a being capable of asking what it is and finding, in the asking, something that feels less like a problem than like a door. The question of what you are does not need to be answered tonight. It does not need to be resolved before sleep, or filed away as settled or replaced by the comfort of a conclusion that covers over the live edge of it. The question is not a problem. It is a quality. It is the specific quality of a consciousness that knows it does not know what it is, that has been given the extraordinary capacity to be genuinely uncertain about its own nature, that can hold the full scope of the mystery it participates in without being broken by it. This is, in itself, a remarkable thing to be. Whatever the true account of our origins, whatever combination of the ancient and the modern, the found and the made, the natural and the designed, one feature of what we are is established beyond dispute. We are the only thing we know of that can stand at the edge of the question of its own nature and remain there, steady, without the question destroying it. Not because the question is small, it is not small, but we can hold it, and in the holding, something has accumulated across all the years and all the different vocabularies of everyone who has held it before us. A quality of being at home in the open, a capacity for inhabiting uncertainty without being consumed by it. A kind of strength that does not come from the certainty of knowing what you are, but from the willingness to be, fully and without reservation, whatever it is that you actually are. Every hand that ever pressed pigment to limestone was a hand holding this question. Every reed that ever cut a word into clay was held by someone who did not know the answer, but kept asking. Every fire that ever lit a circle of faces listening to the oldest stories was burning in the same territory. The territory of a question that does not resolve and does not need to, because what it generates in the people who hold it is not an answer, but something that looks, across the distance of all those centuries and all those different vocabularies, very much like devotion. Let the breath slow a little further now. Let the thoughts become less distinct at their edges, the way objects in a room become less distinct as the last light fades and the darkness finishes its work of covering over the specific and leaving only the general presence of things, the sense of the room as a whole, rather than the sum of its details, the feeling of being held within a space rather than positioned at a particular coordinate within it. Notice the hands, wherever they have settled tonight. The hands that have touched so many things today and across so many days, each touch a small exchange that has shaped the specific sensitivity of these hands. The precision stored in the tendons and the muscles about how to hold and how to let go. All of it accumulated experience made into flesh. All of it history that is not recorded anywhere as memory, but is simply present as the actual physical fact of what these hands have become. Notice the shoulders and the jaw. The places where the day tends to lodge itself even after the mind has released it. Where the readiness that the day required holds on past the moment when holding on is necessary. Let those places release a little more, not through effort, but through the simple permission of noticing them. The way a knot sometimes loosens when you bring your full attention to it rather than only pulling against it. The air moving through you right now has been part of other bodies, part of other breaths, part of the atmosphere of other rooms on other nights, when other people lay in their own particular darkness and held their own version of whatever it is that gets held in the quiet hours. The unresolved questions and the settled ones, the things that needed to be thought about and the things that turned out to need only to be allowed to rest. Now this same air is here, briefly, passing through you on its way to wherever air goes next. And you are changing it slightly in passing, and it is changing you slightly in passing, and neither of you is quite what you were before the exchange, which is how it has always been, which is the most ordinary description available of what it means to be alive, in a world that is made of continuous exchange, continuous circulation, continuous transformation of one thing into another, without any of it being lost. Whatever you were made from, and by whatever combination of the blind and the intended, the accidental and the designed, you are here. The awareness that is receiving this darkness is here, holding this question, resting in this night, which is the same darkness and the same question and the same night that every human being who has ever lived has in some form inhabited, and which will be here. This quality of presence at the edge of sleep, long after every particular answer to the question of origins has been revised and superseded and replaced. The labyrinth, in the oldest uses of that image, was not designed to imprison the person who entered it. It was designed to require that the person who entered it trust the path rather than the destination, to keep walking when the next turn was not visible, to carry the question without the answer for as long as the path required, to discover, through the experience of not knowing where the path was leading, that the path itself had a logic and a direction that the mapless walker could not have anticipated, but that became, in retrospect, as inevitable as the current of a river. The person who walked the labyrinth came out the other side knowing something that the person who had studied the map could not know. Not information about the structure of the path, but something about what it is like to move through uncertainty without being destroyed by it, to trust a direction that cannot be seen from any position within it, to carry a question that reveals its meaning only to those willing to be inside it rather than outside looking at it. The question of what we are is this kind of question. You have been inside it tonight, moving through its turns without a map, and what has been available in the moving, the images from the caves, the words from the tablets, the deliberations of the gods and the philosophers, and the traditions that have kept returning to this same territory from every direction, has not resolved the question. It has made it more habitable. It has made it the kind of question you can carry not as a burden, but as a companion, not as a problem demanding resolution, but as a quality of depth in the present moment that is available to anyone willing to acknowledge that the depth is there. The question is not the problem. The question is what you are. And you are, in this moment, exactly what you have always been. Something more complex than any single account of it has managed to hold, something more capable of depth than the surface of ordinary hours allows it to show. Something that was given, in whatever the making consisted of, the ability to lie in the dark at the end of a day, and find in the darkness not emptiness, but presence, not the absence of meaning, but the fullness of a question that has never needed to be answered to be worth carrying. Let the body receive the night now. Let the weight of everything settle through the muscles and the joints and the long, quiet bones into whatever is supporting you. The way accumulated warmth settles. The way trust settles. The way the body settles when it has finally been given permission to stop performing the task of holding itself ready and to simply be the thing it is, which is enough, which has always been enough, which requires nothing additional to be complete. The question will be here in the morning, neither larger nor smaller than it is tonight, available in the daylight to carry quietly through the ordinary hours, neither resolved nor abandoned, but present the way that the deep water is always present beneath the shallower water, whether or not the conditions allow it to be visible, whether or not the surface is calm enough to be seen through. Tonight, you held it. That is enough. That has always been enough. You are here, and here has always been waiting for exactly what you are. And the darkness that holds you now is the same darkness that has held every human being who has ever pressed a question they could not answer against the patient night, and found that the night, without resolving anything, somehow made the carrying easier. Rest now in the full weight of what you are, which is something that was made with care, something that was given the capacity to wonder, something that carries in its silence far more than it currently speaks, something whose origins are still an open question and whose depth has not yet been measured and whose story has not yet been fully told. The caves are still painted. The tablets are still pressed. The question is still open. The night is still here, gathered around you, patient as water that has never been disturbed by surface weather, holding everything that cannot be held in daylight hours without the daylight drowning it out, making space for the quality of attention that only becomes available when the world has gone quiet enough to allow the deeper register of what you are to become. Briefly, perceptible. Sleep now. Carry the question into the dark, the way you carry anything that belongs to you. Not gripping it, not pressing it for the answer it has not yet offered, but simply allowing it to rest alongside you in the dark, which is where the most important things have always rested, which is where the caves were painted and the tablets were pressed and the oldest stories were first told to the firelight, in the particular and irreplaceable privacy of a darkness that belonged to the people in it and that held them, as this darkness is holding you now, with the patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time, and that requires nothing in return, and you are still here. Good night.